What if I told you that Carl Jung discovered the exact psychological mechanism that traps people in toxic relationships for decades? What if he identified why some people can break free from destructive patterns while others remain stuck in an endless cycle of attraction, conflict, and heartbreak with the same type of toxic partner over and over again? Today we're diving deep into Jung's most disturbing discoveries about toxic relationship cycles. Discoveries so accurate and unsettling that they reveal uncomfortable truths about human psychology that most people would rather ignore. By the end of this video, you'll understand why you keep choosing partners who hurt you, why toxic relationships feel so addictive, and most importantly, how to break free from these destructive patterns forever. But first, let me blow your mind with Jung's most shocking observation. He discovered that people don't end up in toxic relationships by accident. There's a precise psychological mechanism that draws us to toxic partners like magnets, and it's connected to what he called our shadow and our unresolved psychological complexes. The terrifying part? Most people are completely unconscious of this process, which is why they keep repeating the same relationship disasters year after year. The unconscious attraction to toxicity, Jung's disturbing discovery. Jung made an observation that was so controversial it challenged everything we thought we knew about love and attraction. He discovered that we're not just attracted to people who are good for us, we're powerfully drawn to people who activate our deepest psychological wounds and unresolved traumas. This isn't masochism or self-sabotage in the traditional sense. It's something much more sophisticated and unconscious. Jung realized that our psyche has a compulsive need to recreate familiar emotional environments, even when those environments are destructive. We're literally programmed to seek out partners who will recreate the same emotional dynamics we experienced in childhood, particularly with our parents. But here's where it gets really dark. If your childhood was filled with emotional chaos, manipulation, neglect, or abuse, your unconscious mind will interpret those chaotic emotions as love. Your nervous system becomes addicted to the biochemical cocktail of stress hormones, adrenaline, and intermittent reinforcement that toxic relationships provide. Jung called this the repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to repeat traumatic experiences in an attempt to master them. Your psyche believes that if you can finally get a toxic person to love you consistently, you'll heal your original childhood wounds. But this never works because you're trying to get healing from the same type of person who caused the wound in the first place. This is why nice, stable, emotionally available people often feel boring to those trapped in toxic cycles. Their nervous system has become addicted to emotional chaos, and healthy love feels too calm, too predictable, too safe. They mistake peace for lack of passion and chaos for intensity. The complex-driven relationship, when your wounds choose your partners. Jung's concept of psychological complexes is crucial for understanding toxic relationship cycles. A complex is an emotionally charged cluster of unconscious material that operates autonomously in your psyche. Think of it as a subpersonality that has its own agenda, its own emotional reactions, and its own relationship patterns. Most people develop complexes in childhood around themes like abandonment, rejection, inadequacy, or betrayal. These complexes lie dormant in the unconscious until they're triggered by specific relationship dynamics. When activated, they literally take over your personality and decision-making process. Here's the shocking part: your complexes are actively scanning for partners who will activate them. If you have an abandonment complex, you'll be unconsciously drawn to emotionally unavailable partners who are likely to leave. If you have a rejection complex, you'll choose partners who are critical and withholding. If you have an inadequacy complex, you'll be attracted to partners who make you feel small and unworthy. This isn't conscious, you're not deliberately choosing these patterns. Your complex is operating below the threshold of awareness, influencing your attractions, your choices, and your behaviors in relationships. You might think you're choosing someone because they're attractive, successful, or charming, but really your complex is choosing someone because they perfectly match your unconscious template for emotional familiarity. Jung observed that people will often choose partners who embody the negative aspects of their opposite-sex parent. If you had a manipulative mother, you might be drawn to manipulative women. If you had an emotionally distant father, you might choose emotionally unavailable men. Your complex is trying to recreate the original wound so it can finally be healed, but instead it just gets reinforced. The projection cycle, how you create your own toxic reality. One of Jung's most revolutionary insights was about psychological projection in relationships. In toxic cycles, projection becomes a weapon that destroys intimacy and creates endless conflict. But it's not just simple projection. It's a complex interplay of multiple projection layers that create a psychological prison for both partners. In healthy relationships, you see your partner as a separate individual with their own thoughts, feelings, and motivations. In toxic relationships, you're not relating to the actual person. You're relating to a collection of projections, assumptions, and unconscious material that you've overlaid onto them. Here's how the toxic projection cycle works. You project your shadow onto your partner, seeing them as embodying all the qualities you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. If you can't accept your own anger, you'll see your partner as the angry one. If you can't own your selfishness, you'll constantly accuse them of being selfish. If you can't acknowledge your neediness, you'll see them as clingy and demanding. But it gets worse. You also project your anima or animus onto toxic partners, but in a distorted way. Instead of projecting the positive qualities of your inner opposite-sex archetype, you project the negative, undeveloped aspects. This creates an attraction that feels fated and intense, but is actually based on psychological dysfunction. The most insidious part is counter-projection, when your partner projects their own toxicity onto you, and you unconsciously accept and embody their projection. If they project their shame onto you, you start feeling ashamed. If they project their anxiety onto you, you become anxious. If they project their anger onto you, you start acting angry. You literally become a screen for their psychological garbage. This creates a feedback loop where both partners are relating to projections rather than reality, and the projections keep getting stronger and more distorted over time. The relationship becomes a hall of mirrors where nobody can see clearly, and every interaction reinforces the toxic dynamic. The trauma bond, Jung's explanation for addictive love. Jung understood something about toxic relationships that modern psychology is just beginning to grasp. They're not just emotionally damaging, they're literally addictive. He identified what we now call trauma bonding decades before the term was coined, and his insights into why these bonds are so difficult to break are still revolutionary today. According to Jung, trauma bonds form when intermittent reinforcement combines with the activation of deep psychological complexes. The toxic partner provides just enough positive reinforcement, love, attention, validation, to keep you hooked, but withdraws it unpredictably. This creates the same neurochemical addiction pattern that gambling or drug use creates. But Jung's insight goes deeper. He realized that trauma bonding isn't just about the intermittent reinforcement schedule. It's about the unconscious belief that this person holds the key to your psychological healing. Your complex believes that if you can just love them enough, understand them enough, or change yourself enough, they'll finally give you the consistent love that will heal your original wound. This creates what Jung called a participation mystique, a psychological fusion where you lose your individual identity and become enmeshed with your partner's emotional state. You can't tell where your feelings end and theirs begin. Their mood becomes your mood, their problems become your problems, their reality becomes your reality. The addiction isn't really to the person, it's to the fantasy of resolution. Your unconscious mind is convinced that this relationship is your one chance to finally get the love you never received as a child. Breaking up doesn't just feel like losing a partner, it feels like losing your last hope for psychological wholeness. This is why people in toxic relationships often say things like, "I know they're bad for me, but I can't stop loving them," or "I've never felt anything this intense before." The intensity isn't love, it's the activation of your deepest psychological material. It feels significant because it is significant, but not in the way you think. The shadow dance, when two toxic people meet. Jung's concept of the shadow becomes particularly relevant when examining why toxic people are so drawn to each other. The shadow contains all the parts of yourself that you've disowned, repressed, or refused to acknowledge. In healthy individuals, the shadow is relatively integrated and doesn't control their behavior. In toxic individuals, the shadow runs the show. When two people with large, unintegrated shadows come together, they create what Jung might have called a shadow dance, a relationship dynamic where each person's shadow feeds off and reinforces the other's shadow. This creates some of the most destructive, but also most magnetically attractive relationship patterns. The shadow dance explains why toxic relationships often have such intense sexual chemistry. Sexual energy is raw, instinctual, and connected to the shadow. When two people's shadows resonate, the sexual attraction can be overwhelming and feel almost supernatural. This is why people often describe toxic relationships as having the best sex but the worst emotional connection. In the shadow dance, each partner unconsciously gives the other permission to express their disowned parts. The nice person gets to express their repressed aggression through their partner's anger. The rational person gets to experience emotion through their partner's drama. The responsible person gets to be reckless through their partner's impulsiveness. This feels liberating at first because you're finally expressing parts of yourself that have been suppressed. But it's also destructive because you're expressing these parts unconsciously and projectively rather than owning and integrating them. Instead of becoming more whole, you become more fragmented. The shadow dance also explains why toxic couples often have explosive fights followed by passionate makeups. The fight is the shadow expression, all the repressed anger, resentment, and aggression coming out. The makeup is the ego trying to restore control and maintain the relationship. But nothing is actually resolved because the underlying shadows haven't been acknowledged or integrated. The rescue fantasy, Jung's analysis of codependency. Long before codependency became a popular psychological concept, Jung identified the rescue fantasy as one of the most common patterns in toxic relationships. The rescue fantasy is the unconscious belief that you can heal, fix, or save your partner through the power of your love. Jung understood that the rescue fantasy serves several psychological functions for the rescuer. First, it provides a sense of purpose and meaning. Instead of facing your own psychological work, you can focus all your energy on fixing someone else. This feels noble and selfless, but it's actually a sophisticated form of avoidance. Second, the rescue fantasy feeds the ego's need for specialness. You're not just anyone, you're the one person who truly understands them, the only one who can save them, the chosen one who will succeed where everyone else has failed. This grandiose fantasy protects you from facing your own ordinariness and vulnerability. Third, the rescue fantasy is often a projection of your own need to be rescued. By trying to save someone else, you're unconsciously hoping they'll eventually turn around and save you. You're creating the kind of relationship you wish you'd had as a child, one where someone powerful would come and rescue you from your pain. But Jung identified the shadow side of the rescue fantasy. The rescuer is often as psychologically invested in their partner remaining broken as they are in helping them heal. If your identity is built around being the strong, helpful, understanding one, what happens to your sense of self if your partner actually gets healthy and no longer needs you? This creates a perverse dynamic where the rescuer unconsciously sabotages their partner's actual healing while consciously believing they're trying to help. They enable destructive behaviors, make excuses for unacceptable treatment, and prevent their partner from facing natural consequences, all while telling themselves they're being loving and supportive. The rescue fantasy also prevents genuine intimacy because you're not relating to your partner as an equal adult. You're relating to them as a project, a wounded child, or a problem to be solved. You can't have mature love with someone you see as fundamentally broken and in need of your salvation. The inflation-deflation cycle, Jung's pattern of toxic relationships. Jung identified a specific cycle that characterizes most toxic relationships, the inflation-deflation pattern. This cycle is driven by the ego's need to maintain psychological equilibrium in the face of deep unconscious wounds and unresolved complexes. The inflation phase is what most people call the honeymoon period, but Jung's analysis reveals what's really happening psychologically. During inflation, both partners are projecting their positive anima/animus onto each other and experiencing what feels like perfect love. You feel chosen, special, understood in a way you've never been before. But inflation is inherently unstable because it's based on projection rather than reality. As the relationship progresses and you start seeing your partner's actual personality instead of your projection, disillusionment sets in. The positive projections start to flip into negative ones. The deflation phase is when the shadow projections begin. Everything that felt magical and perfect about your partner starts to feel irritating and wrong. Their confidence becomes arrogance, their passion becomes instability, their intensity becomes drama. You start to feel disappointed, betrayed, even disgusted by the person you once idealized. In healthy relationships, this deflation is temporary and leads to a more realistic, sustainable love based on seeing the actual person. In toxic relationships, the deflation becomes permanent, but instead of leaving, both partners become addicted to trying to recreate the inflation phase. This creates a cycle where periods of intense conflict and emotional withdrawal are followed by brief returns to the initial passion and connection. Each time you reconnect, your unconscious mind believes you found your way back to real love, but you're actually just experiencing temporary inflation again. The cycle becomes increasingly extreme over time. The inflation phases become shorter and more desperate, while the deflation phases become longer and more bitter. Both partners develop an addiction to the neurochemical highs and lows, mistaking emotional intensity for deep connection. Jung understood that breaking this cycle requires consciousness, the ability to see the pattern while you're in it and choose to respond differently. But most people caught in toxic cycles lack this level of self-awareness and continue repeating the pattern until the relationship finally implodes or one person develops enough consciousness to break free. The complex constellation, when your wounds find each other. One of Jung's most sophisticated insights about toxic relationships involves what he called complex constellations. This occurs when the unconscious complexes of two people become entangled in such a way that they create a shared psychological field that's greater than the sum of its parts. When two people with complementary complexes meet, their individual wounds don't just coexist, they merge into a shared complex that takes on a life of its own. For example, someone with an abandonment complex might constellation with someone who has an engulfment complex. The abandoner's fear of being trapped triggers the abandoned person's fear of being left, creating a push-pull dynamic that becomes the defining characteristic of their relationship. The terrifying aspect of complex constellations is that once they form, both partners lose their individual psychological autonomy. The constellation becomes like a third entity in the relationship, an autonomous complex that controls both people's behavior and keeps them locked in destructive patterns. Jung observed that people caught in complex constellations often report feeling like they become different people in the relationship. They act in ways that are completely out of character, make decisions that go against their values, and find themselves unable to behave rationally even when they can see clearly what's happening. This is because the constellation has created what Jung called a participation mystique, a psychological fusion where individual identity becomes secondary to the complex's agenda. The complex wants to be expressed, to be fed, to be validated, regardless of what's good for the actual people involved. Breaking free from a complex constellation requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel the full intensity of your psychological wounds without acting them out through the relationship. You have to withdraw your projections, own your shadow, and reclaim your individual identity from the merged complex. This is extremely difficult because the constellation feels like your identity. Leaving the relationship doesn't just mean losing a partner, it means facing the terror of psychological dissolution, of not knowing who you are without the familiar dance of your activated complexes. The eternal return, why you keep choosing the same person. Jung's concept of the eternal return explains one of the most frustrating aspects of toxic relationship cycles. Why people who finally escape one toxic relationship almost inevitably find themselves in another one that feels exactly the same, just with a different person. The eternal return occurs because the underlying psychological constellation hasn't been resolved, it's just been transferred to a new person. Your complexes, your projections, your shadow material, and your unconscious patterns remain exactly the same. You might choose someone who looks completely different, has a different background, or different surface characteristics, but unconsciously you're drawn to the same psychological type. Jung understood that we don't choose partners based on their conscious personality, we choose them based on how they activate our unconscious material. Two people can appear completely different on the surface but function identically in terms of complex activation. The shy, intellectual narcissist and the loud, dramatic narcissist will both trigger your complexes in the same way if you have narcissistic attraction patterns. This is why people often report feeling like they're dating the same person over and over again. They are, in a psychological sense. Their unconscious is selecting for the same complex activation, the same familiar emotional environment, the same opportunities to replay their original wounds. The eternal return also explains why people often feel like they can predict their partner's behavior with uncanny accuracy, even early in the relationship. You're not psychic, you're recognizing archetypal patterns that you've experienced many times before. Your unconscious knows exactly how this story goes because you've lived it repeatedly. Breaking the eternal return requires what Jung called individuation, the conscious integration of your shadow, the withdrawal of your projections, and the development of genuine self-awareness. You have to become conscious of your unconscious patterns before you can choose differently. This is why therapy, shadow work, and psychological development are so crucial for people caught in toxic cycles. You can't think your way out of unconscious patterns, you have to make them conscious through deep inner work. The death-rebirth cycle in toxic relationships. Jung identified a death-rebirth pattern that occurs in long-term toxic relationships, where the relationship goes through cycles of apparent ending followed by resurrection. This pattern is particularly insidious because it creates the illusion of growth and change while actually reinforcing the toxic dynamic. The death phase occurs when the relationship becomes so painful that one or both partners decides it has to end. There might be a final fight, a period of separation, or a formal breakup. During this phase, both partners often experience genuine relief and clarity. They can see how destructive the relationship was and feel determined to move on. But then the rebirth phase begins. The pain of separation activates deep attachment wounds and abandonment fears. The positive projections return, and both partners start remembering only the good times. They begin to believe that the problems were just communication issues or bad timing, that they can make it work if they just try harder. The rebirth feels spiritual and significant because it is, but not in the way the participants think. What's actually happening is that the complex constellation is reasserting itself. The psychological fusion is so strong that the individuals literally can't maintain separate identities for long. Each death-rebirth cycle tends to be more intense than the last. The breakups become more dramatic, the reconciliations more passionate, and the overall emotional stakes higher. This escalation creates an addiction to the cycle itself. The relationship becomes less about the actual partnership and more about the intense emotional experiences of ending and beginning. Jung understood that true death-rebirth in relationships requires the actual death of the old unconscious patterns, not just temporary separation. Real transformation happens when you can stay present with the psychological material that the relationship activates without needing to act it out through the relationship dynamic. The golden shadow, when you're addicted to toxic partners' positive qualities. Jung's concept of the golden shadow reveals another layer of why toxic relationships are so addictive. The golden shadow contains not just the negative qualities you've disowned, but also positive qualities that you've failed to develop in yourself. Toxic partners often carry projected golden shadow material, which creates an attraction that feels like spiritual destiny. For example, if you've suppressed your own confidence and assertiveness, you might be powerfully drawn to someone who embodies these qualities, even if they express them in narcissistic or aggressive ways. If you've disowned your creativity and passion, you might be attracted to someone artistic and intense, even if they're also unstable and unreliable. The golden shadow projection creates a particular kind of dependency where you feel like your partner completes you or brings out your best self. You experience qualities through them that you can't access on your own: confidence, creativity, spontaneity, power. This feels like love, but it's actually psychological dependency disguised as romance. The tragedy of golden shadow projections is that they prevent you from developing these qualities in yourself. Instead of working to become more confident, you depend on your partner's confidence. Instead of developing your own creativity, you live vicariously through theirs. Instead of building your own power, you try to possess theirs. This creates a dynamic where you need your partner to be dysfunctional in the very areas where they carry your golden shadow. If they were truly healthy and integrated, they wouldn't be able to carry your projections, and you'd lose access to the qualities you experience through them. The golden shadow also explains why people often feel like they lose themselves when toxic relationships end. You're not just losing a partner, you're losing access to parts of yourself that you've only experienced through projection. The breakup feels like psychological amputation because, in a sense, it is. Breaking free: Jung's path to conscious relationships. Jung's approach to breaking toxic relationship cycles is fundamentally different from modern therapeutic approaches because it focuses on consciousness and individuation rather than just behavioral change. He understood that you can't create healthy relationships from an unconscious state. You have to develop genuine self-awareness first. The first step in Jung's approach is what he called making the unconscious conscious. This means becoming aware of your complexes, your projections, and your shadow material. You have to understand why you're attracted to toxic people, what wounds are being activated, and what psychological needs you're trying to meet through these relationships. This requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel your psychological pain without numbing it through relationships, substances, or other distractions. You have to sit with the abandonment fears, the inadequacy feelings, the shame, and the terror that drive your toxic attraction patterns. The second step is withdrawing your projections. This means learning to see your partners as separate individuals rather than screens for your unconscious material. It means owning your shadow instead of seeing it in them, and developing your golden shadow qualities instead of trying to possess them through others. The third step is what Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with your anima or animus to understand what you're really looking for in relationships. Instead of seeking these qualities through projection onto partners, you develop a conscious relationship with your inner opposite-sex archetype. The fourth step is shadow integration, consciously acknowledging and accepting the parts of yourself that you've been trying to disown or express through others. This includes both negative qualities, anger, selfishness, neediness, and positive ones, power, creativity, sexuality. The final step is individuation, becoming a whole, conscious individual who chooses relationships from completeness rather than emptiness. When you're individuated, you're attracted to partners who enhance your wholeness rather than ones who fill your psychological gaps. The Jung Show revisited Jung's vision of conscious love. Jung's ultimate vision for relationships was what he called the Jung Show, the sacred marriage between two individuated people. But his insights about toxic relationship cycles reveal why this is so rare and what it actually requires. The Jung Show is only possible when both partners have broken free from their toxic patterns, integrated their shadows, and withdrawn their projections. It requires two people who are psychologically whole choosing to create something together, rather than two fragmented people trying to complete each other. In conscious relationships, conflict becomes a tool for mutual growth rather than a weapon for mutual destruction. When disagreements arise, Both partners can recognize their own projections and take responsibility for their psychological material instead of blaming each other. Attraction in conscious relationships is based on genuine appreciation for the other person's authentic self rather than projection of unconscious material. You're drawn to your partner's actual qualities, their consciousness, their growth, their unique perspective, rather than what they represent archetypally. Jung understood that conscious relationships require ongoing psychological work from both partners. It's not enough to achieve individuation once. You have to continually choose consciousness over unconsciousness, integration over projection, authentic love over psychological need. Your liberation, applying Jung's insights to your life. The first step to breaking your toxic relationship cycles is brutal honesty about your patterns. Look at your relationship history and identify the common themes. What type of person are you consistently attracted to? What dynamics keep repeating? What role do you always end up playing? Next, identify your core complexes. What are your deepest fears in relationships? Abandonment, rejection, inadequacy, betrayal? These fears are driving your attraction patterns and keeping you trapped in cycles that reinforce rather than heal your wounds. Practice shadow work by identifying what qualities in your past partners triggered the strongest positive and negative reactions. The qualities you found most attractive and most repulsive are often projections of your own disowned material. Develop a conscious relationship with your anima or animus through active imagination, journaling, or therapy. What are you really looking for in a partner? What qualities do you need to develop in yourself instead of seeking through others? Most importantly, commit to your own individuation process. Become the kind of person who's attracted to healthy, conscious partners rather than trying to fix toxic ones. This requires developing genuine self-worth, integrating your shadow, and learning to meet your own emotional needs. Remember that breaking toxic cycles is not just about finding better relationships. It's about becoming a more conscious, integrated human being. The relationships are just the reflection of your inner psychological state. Jung's insights about toxic relationship cycles are as relevant today as they were a century ago because human psychology hasn't changed. We're still driven by the same unconscious forces, still trapped by the same complexes, still seeking completion through others instead of finding it within ourselves. But Jung also showed us the path to freedom. Through consciousness, shadow integration, and individuation, we can break free from the cycles that have controlled our love lives and create relationships based on authentic connection rather than psychological need. The choice is yours. You can continue repeating the same patterns, hoping for different results, or you can do the deep work of making your unconscious patterns conscious and choosing love from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness. Your liberation begins with understanding that you're not a victim of your relationship patterns. You're an unconscious participant in them. And once you become conscious, everything changes. The toxic attractions lose their power, healthy love becomes possible, and you finally break free from the cycles that have kept you trapped. The path isn't easy, but it's the only way to genuine freedom in love. Jung showed us that toxic relationship cycles aren't just personal problems, they're opportunities for psychological evolution. The question is, are you ready to evolve?